Move now to our next panel, continuing a focus on equity and students. And as I welcome in Lara Couturier and Tina Gridiron and Elena, Tina and Elena both on our Equity Advisory Council, I just want to take a second and recognize and appreciate the support of the Gates Foundation for helping to fund our Equity Advisory Council over the last year and into next year, as we're working to help put forward Credential Engine's role in ensuring that equity is front and center in our work and in transparency of this entire marketplace. We were thrilled to welcome Lara and HCM team to support us in this effort. They are experts. Lara and her partner, her colleague, Kristen Moore, are experts in this space and helped us pull the advisory group together. So Lara is going to facilitate a conversation about the Equity Advisory Council now. Lara?
Good afternoon, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. So pleased to be here today. My name is Lara Couturier, and I will be moderating today's panel with two members of the Equity Advisory Council, as Scott noted, Elena Quiroz-Livanis and Tina Gridiron. My goal is to get us as quickly as possible to hearing from them, but I do want to take a moment to quickly describe their very impressive backgrounds and the expertise that they bring to this conversation, and then also to provide a very brief overview of what the Equity Advisory Council is. So let me start with an introduction of our panelists. Tina, I'll turn to you first. So Tina Gridiron serves as the Vice President for ACT's Center for Equity in Learning. And in this role, she strives to build, enhance, and embed equity across the ACT enterprise. By strengthening and supporting ACT's internal DEI efforts and building collaborations with external equity-focused leaders and organizations, Tina helps to support ACT's broader efforts to close equity gaps in opportunity and outcomes in the education and workforce arenas, making her a terrific representative for the Equity Advisory Council. Prior to joining ACT in 2019, as I'm sure many of you know, Tina led grant initiatives as an officer and director for Lumina Foundation. And she has over 20 years of experience as a higher education professional with a deep commitment to data-informed action, equity-informed research, and culturally responsive policy. And Tina holds a Master of Arts in Higher Education Administration and a Master of Arts in Sociology, both from Stanford University, and she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California at Berkeley. So Tina, thank you for being with us. I will be back to you in just one moment. So now I'm going to turn to Elena Quiroz-Livanis. Elena is the Chief of Staff and Assistant Commissioner of Academic Policy and Student Success at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. She oversees the equity agenda and most recently system-wide efforts to create and implement a 10-year strategic plan for racial equity. She is also co-designer of the Commonwealth's Unified System of Transfer and is leading the state's efforts to transform developmental education. And very excitingly, Elena is also a doctoral candidate in the higher ed program at University of Massachusetts at Boston. And again, both of these panelists bring incredible expertise on equity as well as data. So let me just take a quick moment before I start posing questions to them, to describe the Equity Advisory Council. So in 2022, Credential Engine launched the council to advance understanding and action about equitable pathways, transfer, and recognition of learning. The council's goals are threefold. They are to identify the data elements that help to describe how learning opportunities are intentionally designed for equity, the data elements that are aligned to learner outcomes that demonstrate equity is being achieved, and then a set of principles or guidelines for the appropriate and effective use of these data to encourage providers in the space to be both collecting, analyzing, and publishing these critical data elements that will be identified by the Equity Advisory Council. And the Equity Council is a broad coalition of 16 equity-focused stakeholders who represent organizations in spaces such as institutions, state systems, employers and workforce, K through 12, and nonprofit and advocacy organizations. So that's just some background. And now that you all have heard what the Equity Advisory Council is, I'm going to ask our panelists to come off of mute and tell you all, why did they agree to participate in this council? And what are some of your hopes in being part of the council? And I see Tina's off mute already, so I'll turn to her first.
So thank you, Laura. It's great to be a part of this conversation today and to celebrate 5 years for Credential Engine. When I was invited to serve as part of the Equity Advisory Council, of course, I was honored to be invited with so many great leaders across the spectrum that are leaning in on issues of equity and issues of success for learners from all backgrounds, learners who are experiencing financial challenges. So it was an honor to be invited. But as many of you know, ACT has a significant track record as an organization engaged in the WorkKeys National Career Readiness Certificate and as a credential for individuals and job seekers that desire to verify their foundational workplace skills and to engage with employers with a credential that is adding value. I felt it was a great opportunity for ACT to be in the conversation with other leaders that are thinking with an equity first agenda, that are thinking with an equity focused agenda as we explore what some have called the wild, wild west of the credentialing space. So from a professional standpoint, it was a great opportunity for ACT to lean in and explore how we might be a part of the conversation. It was a great way for me to consider that as the Equity Council provides or develops recommendations that the field will wrestle with, that the 500 work-ready communities that are part of the ACT network that are taking advantage of the National Career Readiness Certificate, that our 500 work-ready communities will be able to access and be improved by and enhanced by the recommendations coming from the council. So why did I join this or agree to say yes to be a part of this? Is because, of course, I have respect for the Credential Engine and the great work of the organization, knowing from its early days through Lumina's investment in the Credential Engine, I have great respect for the leadership in Credential Engine. Two, that it was a great opportunity for ACT to learn from leaders who are wrestling with an equity first, equity focus, equity mindset in their work. Three, that it was an opportunity to not only have conversations, but then to put those conversations and recommendations into action through our Work Ready Communities program of 500 communities, some 28,000 employers that are looking to ACT for valuable information that will improve their work. It was, for me, the opportunity to be in the room with right people engaged in right conversations, doing the right things for the right purposes. So I was honored to be invited, and I look forward to staying engaged with the leaders in the council. Thanks, Lara.
Thank you, Tina. Elena, can we turn to you?
I hope so. When I had this, everyone, it's great to be here. I don't know, we're 2.5 years into a global pandemic, and Lara unfortunately knows this, like every time I come into our state office, for some reason, there is just not enough bandwidth. So for those of you watching at home, my sincere apologies. Tina is one of the reasons why I joined the group, right? And so like, I think Tina, you kind of spoke exactly about the kind of vibe, if you will, that's a technical term that we've created, I think, nationally in the space with folks who are interested in this equity first agenda. And so having an opportunity to bring folks from so many different industries together. I work at a state office, we have philanthropy, industry, and different higher ed adjacent folks who are policymakers and folks who are working at the institution, all coming together to talk about this really important space. And the learning has been absolutely incredible. And the fact that we are being asked to work on developing tangible recommendations, I think to me also signaled when being asked to join that this wasn't a group that was just about talk. We were really kind of moving beyond the rhetoric, particularly in the space around credentials, which is so unknown, right? Like to so many people, and the fact that this group under Scott Cheney's leadership was willing to put equity as a consideration, right? And not wait till things were too far down the road in the development process to ensure that equity was a central point, I think has been incredibly amazing. And in Massachusetts, like Lara said, we have centered racial equity specifically and making sure that our policies and programs who are not designed for Black and Brown students, that when we redesign them, better support these marginalized communities and making sure that all forms of credentials are available to them and we understand what that value is and we can communicate that value to employers and students. That's part of addressing the equity disparities that I think we often see in our post-secondary outcomes, particularly as we are now kind of moving beyond the attainment of a credential, but like a meaningful credential that is going to help our students really with that upward economic and social mobility. And so to be asked to be a part of this group was honestly an honor. I've learned so much. I didn't really have to ask permission, to be honest. Like when I forwarded the email to leadership, they were like, you don't have a choice, please say yes, because it's such an incredibly important discussion.
Terrific. Thank you. So you all both hinted at this in your opening remarks. So let's stay with the theme of, what are your reflections on how equity is currently being addressed in the field, in particular around data usage, so that we can set that context before we move into what some of the recommendations are. And I'll just flip things around a bit and ask Elena to go first this time.
I think there's a lot around data usage that's happening. And as a state office, one thing that often I hear is lack of access to administrative data. And just what are the things that we can do to make data not only more accessible and transparent, but more actionable. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Credential Engine and their work is just like access and availability of data and the ability to make sure that that's customizable for the systems that you might need, whatever your needs are within the organization. And so, I mean, more broadly outside of this space, I think we're asking people to do things that they should have been doing a long time ago, right? And they were, and that's around like disaggregating data. And I don't mean using phrases like white, non-white. I'm a Latina, I'm not non-white. Right, like so that, making sure that we're breaking those categories down, making sure that we're defining equity, I think is really important. And then understanding that the use of the data, interpretation of the data can also be objective. And I think people think that that's often the case, and then you realize it's not, right? Like that it's actually subjective. And then you kind of assume that people didn't have a bias and they weren't answering questions without really, or asking questions without understanding their positionality. And I think now the conversation around data isn't just about access and transparency, but like, how are you using it? Who is using it? And how do you show up when you're working with these data? Especially if we're trying to address equity gaps and address racial disparities. So you can obviously use it to make the case, but you need to use data also to continue to monitor progress. And the last thing I'll say is data holds all of us accountable. So one thing that we've done in Massachusetts is to start publishing institutional data, and then we disaggregate it by race, gender, and Pell. And so we hope to be able to collect more data around LGBTQIA status as well as first gen, even if you're a parent, but making that data accessible. It took us quite some time and there was some consensus building. So it's not something that happens from the top down, but in partnership with people, you can get some really amazing collaborations and data dashboards. So the tools are available for us. I think it's a matter of leveraging them and making it something that makes sense to whatever your constituent group is.
Thank you, Elena. Tina, do you want to respond?
I would. So Elena has absolutely set the table. I was thinking about the current conversations in the field and the organizations that I see across the ecosystem that are making equity and the conversation around racial equity and income equity a central part of their dialogue about their data collection, and then about the use of the data to inform policy and practice. I am encouraged by the work of Complete College America and the work that they are doing by placing equity front and center in their work. Of course, my dear colleagues from the California Competes organization that have made a commitment to equity and a commitment to data-informed practice and policy and interventions a part of their DNA. I see encouraging elements like what we see with Complete College America, like what we see with California Competes. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the emerging work around Credentials as you go and their equity and inclusion conversations. What I see in the field is a desire for organizations, for leaders to lean in, to have the necessary conversations, to recognize that we have a growing population of students of color and, unfortunately, growing inequities in our economic world for different communities. And there is a need to disaggregate the information to know if you are serving all well, that without the disaggregated fine grain analysis, we might miss areas of growth and improvement that we need to lean in on. So in the field, I see promising conversations. I see emerging action. Of course, there's always room for deeper action, more accelerated action, more enhanced action that leads to positive student outcomes, but I see promise. We know that there is robust data collection around cost considerations for learners and individuals who are engaged in the credential ecosystem. We know that financial assistance information is readily available for students or for learners that are in the ecosystem. And we know that there is a concerted effort for providers to be clear about the completion results for individuals engaged in the credentialing programs that are out there. Kudos to those among the 20, I couldn't remember the quote that Scott had at the beginning, but the thousands of providers that are out there that are thinking through cost considerations, financial aid considerations, and completion information. The disaggregation of that data is where we have room for considerable growth, and the action to change course, to improve practice and policy so that we truly serve all is still an area for growth. The field is having the right conversations, and we're seeing leaders step up and declare that this is not a nice to have, it is a must have in our work. It is an essential for our global democracy, for our state engagement, for the enrichment of individuals and families. And it is an exciting time to be a part of the education and workforce ecosystem through this work.
Can I just say, y'all are better than Netflix. I could just get a cup of coffee and listen to you all day. Thank you for the passion, the commitment you bring to your work. It's really energizing and inspiring. So, you were talking a little bit about where the field is. And so for our audience, the Equity Advisory Council has been working throughout 2022 and has a draft set of recommendations. So we're going to turn now to inviting Tina and Elena to talk a little bit about how those recommendations are shaping up at this time. I'll leave it to you to decide who wants to go first. Oh, that's not going to work. Okay, Tina, you're going first.
I was going to give Tina a little break because she also had me going. And I know that we can't see our audience members, but I'm sure Tina, many of them were doing what I was doing, which just was vigorously shaking my head. So that passion, I think, is something that I just want to share with folks, is what most people, if not everyone, I think, is bringing to the Equity Advisory Council. And basically what this advisory council has done in its development of recommendations is center equity. It's not an add-on. That is literally all we're talking about in the advisory council, which I think is incredibly powerful. And so there's been a series of convenings, and I just want to give the Credential Engine team a shout out, because the process itself is equitable. Like when you talk about like, how are you moving forward? Is there equity in the design? And if it's not, then you're not going to get an equitable set of recommendations. So I think the team has been really intentional, starting with defining what does equity mean to all of us, because we all, however many folks are on this webinar today, probably have a different operating definition of equity. So I think starting there is really important as far as like framing the recommendations and what the philosophy, if you will, is of the group. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about the recommendations is that they're tiered. And I'm sure Tina can talk more about like the individual recommendations, but there's two things that I would like to say. One is that they're interoperable, which is just like anytime you're asking folks for additional data, or you're talking about like, what are the additional data elements that we need to collect? Like, are they going to be able to talk to one another, or are you just kind of starting from somewhere new? And I think when you're talking about the systems and applications and the data that we're collecting through Credential Engine, they have to be able to talk to one another. And so the fact that that is something that is under consideration, I think is really important for anyone who is ultimately going to be using these data. And then, we gave the group a lot to think about. As an equity advisory council, I think they might have had to stop convening us for a little bit, because the work was just kind of like additive, and it was just like more and more and more, because we kept getting these really great ideas. And so what the team did was they accepted all of our ideas, but they tiered them for us so we can kind of see where they land in the landscape of like what's already available through Credential Engine. Is it something that's going to have to be a brand new collection? Who has those data? Who are the keepers of those data? Are they easily accessible or not? And if they're not, that doesn't mean that they're not worth collecting, but that's going to require some additional thinking. And again, that goes back to the intentionality of the Equity Advisory Council and Credential Engine more broadly, is that has to be actionable. And if it's not actionable, then like, what's the point? And so I think that intentionality is a word that I'm going to keep using, because you don't often see that in these spaces. It's just recommendations for the sake of recommendations, and they don't really go anywhere. And the fact that we're trying to operationalize them is great.
So in some ways, I think Elena and I are providing a teaser so that everyone on this call, you are going to want to run to grab the recommendations when they come out, to digest them with your teams and with your networks, and then think through what are the baby steps that you can take, as well as the risks you can take for the big steps that are needed. Elena mentioned that the recommendations are in a tiered form, and what I was excited, the consultants working with Credential Engine are amazing in how they took the wealth of and the rich dialogue that we had and then distilled it into actionable pieces. But the tiers are the no excuses tier. That's the top tier, where everyone might think through, this is where we all must be for the baseline of moving this work forward. So we've got the no excuses tier, and then we have the second tier, which is the time to stretch. Are there ways that we can build and publish and analyze and move forward? So the second tier is a time to stretch. If you are one of the 59,000+ providers that you might already have some baseline data, then the stretching is using that data to inform practice and policy and making the transformation. And then the third tier is the future forward, the long-term view. When we think about tracking outcomes for the individuals and learners that are participating in our credential ecosystem, if they take advantage of our credentials, how do we know what is happening in their lives 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out? Did the credential make a difference, not just for them, but for their family, for the community that they live? What are some of the stories and narratives that we can tell once we have engaged in all three of the tiers that are going to make a difference? We know that design matters. We know that how we design something then impacts the types of outcomes that we can have. And as individual leaders committed to equity, committed to student success, committed to transparency in all pathways that a student might explore, We know that an individual, the leaders on this call, we have the power to change because only individuals ever did make the change. So when we think about the future, that future forward, that third tier, it's about the long-term outcomes in order to change the field so that the design principles that we put in place today, where equity is first, equity focus is embedded, and equity mindset is not an afterthought, but is a central thought, that we will see a different community engagement, a different level of participation in the education and workforce ecosystem that truly serves all. I'm excited about the recommendations that are sure to come out this spring. So please know you might have to wait just a little bit longer in order to get your hands on them. But if you are wondering if the Credential Engine community is thinking about equity, the answer is yes. And we are excited about joining you in getting to action around the recommendations once they come out. Lara?
Thank you. Boy, this time is flying by. I can't believe it. So let me turn to, you all have given a preview. These recommendations will come out this spring, and a piece of the recommendations will also include principles of data usage. And Elena, you talked earlier about sometimes people assume that data is objective, but isn't, and is in fact quite subjective. And so can you all speak to why you think adding principles for data usage into the recommendations is an important way to round them out? And I'll turn to Elena.
I think it's exactly for that reason that you just kind of mentioned, Lara. And I mean, I think one of the, trying to take a step back, like in Massachusetts, we use racial equity principles to define everything we do. So there is a set of them, and whether you're policy making, program designing our performance measurement reporting system, there are a set of principles. And I think part of what design principles in this case do is they remove the opportunity to provide excuses. Like one thing that people do all the time is like, I can't do it. I don't have the resources. I actually don't really know what this thing is, or like there's nobody here who knows how to use these data in that kind of way. Or I don't have an equity-minded data person. Like my data person is over here, but my chief equity officer is over here, and they're never talking to one another. And then you have my program design, academic affairs folks over there, and it would be wonderful if they all got together. And I think what principles of design do is they give people common language. So folks that might be siloed and not working together, the fact that they might then have common language through these design principles that are equity minded, I couldn't wait. I mean, I can't wait. Like this is one of the things, and folks are right, like Tina's enthusiasm is like, I'm going to bring her to Massachusetts, because one thing that we have available through Credential Engine is state partnerships, right? And so I think one of the things that will then do is allow other folks who aren't a part of the conversation to also engage in that language through the design principles and say like, oh yeah, these resonate with us, and we'd like to converse with you on like how we might be able to share our data to make sure that it's actionable. And to Tina's point, like we're designing and redesigning for the sake of the learner, because otherwise they're just like circular conversations. That's just something that I think is good policy and program design making, honestly. And it's just not, it goes back to that intentionality point around like everything that this group is doing. Tina, I'll turn it over to you.
I could just say ditto, ditto, ditto to everything that Elena has already shared. When we think about having unified principles for data usage, we are establishing common language, common expectations, and foundational elements for increased consistency and intentionality. We are ensuring that together we achieve long-term impact. My experience at the Lumina Foundation, when I would bring 15 grantees together to do work around issues of race and income for student success in the traditional higher education pathway, that together there was a lot of learning, sharing, momentum building, as well as cover when things got hard. So by developing principles that we can all move forward together in adopting, It provides not only a benchmark so that each individual provider can move forward, but a cover and a collective, let's say, protection when things get hard. We know that sometimes conversations around race and income can be fraught with contentious elements or divisive elements or frictions. And so by having this document, this recommendation set, by having a community of leaders that are ready to join together to follow the principles, to engage in the hard work together, we have the greater possibility of staying the course. What we don't need, what the learners in our systems don't need, is a start and stop approach. We need continuous movement, continuous courage and strength, fortitude to stay the course. And the principles, the common language, common expectation, the foundational elements, the increased consistency allow for the greater possibility of long-term impact. And at the end of the day, we want to know that students and learners are served well by the ecosystem that we build. And the principles help to get us there.
Can I add two things, like just that, you know, Tina's got me, Tina always has me thinking. The piece that I appreciate also about like Credential Engine's work is the common language everywhere, right? Like it's just like this effort to have common definitions, a common like understanding of what these data elements are. That's huge, right? Like you have all of these tens of thousands of providers who are out there using these different definitions. And I think that consistency point that Tina just pointed out, it's throughout the body of work that I see Credential Engine engaged in, and that's incredibly valuable to the field. And I think to your point, that's the learner-centeredness of the conversation. I think in the development of the recommendations and the design principles, I feel like there isn't 5 minutes that doesn't go by in the equity advisory conversation when we're not bringing it back to the learner. So that's just, Tina, I can't wait to have you in Massachusetts.
Wonderful. I'm sad to say we are at the end of our time. So I'm going to just, sorry, just dropped my phone as I was checking the time. I would love to just ask you all if you have one final message you'd love to leave the audience with as we wrap up here. And I'll go to Tina since Elena just spoke.
Sounds great. I would just say, I found the statistic. If we have 59,000 providers, $2 trillion spent, 1 million credentials, that we have a lot of work ahead of us. But if I turn to my colleague, Travian Shorters, who is part of an organization called Be Me, and he talks about asset-based narratives, where if we come to the table with the narrative that learners are ready and hungry for high value credentials that are going to make a difference for themselves and their families, if we believe that learners are capable to achieve great things when we increase the transparency and consistency and the value add of our credentials, if we come to the space believing that all learners have the potential to maximize their life journey as a result of the credential ecosystem that we are helping to build, then we will build and design for the success for the future. Where I sit at ACT, we have 500 communities, over 500 community colleges, over 26,000 employers that are turning to ACT to ask us, what should we do in the equity space? So I'm excited about digesting the recommendations, sharing the recommendations, and then acting on the recommendations for my own organization, because iron sharpens iron, as well as for the networks where ACT has influence. So I thank Credential Engine for the opportunity to be a part of this and look forward to the future.
Thank you, Tina. And Elena?
Can I say ditto? I'll start with thank you to Credential Engine for inviting Massachusetts to be a part of the conversation. At this point in 2022, Laura, I just feel like there's no excuses. Like, I'm just like, this is the work that the Equity Advisory Council has done, I think is in many ways to provide that cover, right, that Tina is talking about, if folks feel like they need that cover. And there's a community of folks talking about this. So if you are out in your organization feeling like you are alone, like I also just want to amplify the fact that there are a community of people who are having this conversation, and you shouldn't have to do it alone. Because when you're talking about race, racism, and white supremacy and how it shows up in higher education, you need to do it in community. And relatedly, for too long, we have seen our learners in a deficit point of view, and I think Tina kind of mentioned this as well. They are assets themselves. Like, we are lucky when they show up to any one of our organizations to come and earn a credential. We are lucky to have them. And I think if we start to see them as the thing that makes us great, and if we really kind of also internalize that fact that learning happens anywhere and everywhere, and we start to make sure that people have the credit for that, we're going to start to see the type of cultural change that we need in order to make sure that the rest of the design of the systems and the structures keeps up.
Brilliant. Well, so excited to see the next steps that both of you take in your roles. So excited for the Equity Advisory Council to put out its recommendations. Thank you a million times over for all the wonderful work you do in service to students. And I'm going to turn to Scott for the next session.